So let's begin. So we were discussing grounds for divorce. We finished that topic pretty much. Definitely did it extensively and seems to have triggered a lot of discussion and sentiment. So that's good, I guess. So now I'd like to do is discuss another interesting topic. And then after that, we're going to start going straight from the beginning of the Masechta. Okay. So the interesting other topic, everybody has the Marva Komos that were sent out
good evening.
last week?
They're on the link that Sheila sent out.
Because we're going to need them this evening. We're going to need them. Okay. So let's turn our attention to an interesting Mishnah in Gittin. If those of you have a regular Gemara, you can follow as well. It's the Mishnah on Pei Beis Amud Aleph, the beginning of the last parak of Gittin. We're going to do another small topic in this last parak before we shift over to the first parak. If in the Mar Makomos, it's on page 2. It's on the second page. Talmud Babli Masechet Gittin Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Everybody have that? Or you can open up your Gemaras to Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Okay. So the Mishnah says as following: if anybody is having trouble following and needs me to repeat the place or whatever, just let me know. Good. So the Mishnah says Hamagarish Asishto. Very interesting Mishnah. If a person divorces his wife, remember the Masechta is about the topic of divorce. So these are all divorce cases. The Amar law Hareat Muteres l'chol adam ela leploni. So what's unique about this case? Typically, a divorce has to be across the board, meaning there has to be a heter to marry anybody who's marriageable, obviously, who's permissible, as a husband. It's not appropriate for the soon-to-be ex-husband, right, to impose any kind of restriction on the marital license occasioned by the divorce. It should be, ideally, that she can marry anybody who is marriageable.
So what you're saying is you can't be any loose strings. Once you're gone, right?
Exactly. Number one, there shouldn't be loose strings. That's, remember that the Torah in Parshas Kiteitzei, describing a get, says, because of, sefer krisus, you write a sefer krisus. The word krisus is understood by Chazal to refer to davar hakores beino levena, meaning it cuts their ties and it ends any kind of influence that one party has on the other. It's a divorce, as sad as it is, should be a clean divorce with no strings attached, no leftover, authority or contingency. That's certainly the ideal. Moreover, then the Torah says, "V'kasav l'sefer krisus, v'nasan biyada," right? V'shilcha mibeso, right? And then it says, "V'yatza v'haisa le'ish acher." She goes out, and if she wants, and after the divorce, she can marry another person. So part of divorce is ending the bond, and therefore any kind of restrictions or restraints from one party on the other. And part of divorce is the potential to re-enter the marketplace of marriage, right? To continue one's life. And that's obviously a very healthy and very appropriate thing. But what would happen if, notwithstanding that ideal, let's say the husband made a condition that his divorce would only apply, right, if she agreed not to marry a particular individual. Okay? Is that ma'akev? Does that
just
or no?
Just to be clear, if he would say, "Here's a divorce. and I will pay you X not to marry someone, that would be okay, right? In other words, we're talking about within the parameters of a get. In other words, he can motivate her in other ways, right? If she agrees.
He can't impose the condition that
on the get,
right.
But he can impose new financial incentives.
Yeah, if she agrees, that's something else. But right, we're talking about biblical divorce, which is can be imposed on one side, and we're saying that it won't. What'll happen if that side imposes not as an act of consent, but imposes the condition that a particular individual is excluded, from future marriage? Can he do that or not? So that's the Mishnah. Hamegarish asishto, v'amalai seter harei at muteres l'chol adam. So far, so good, right? It says you can marry anybody you want. Ella, then comes except leploni, not this one individual. So Rabbi Eliezer matir, the Chachamim osrim. Rabbi Eliezer says, even though he's excluding one individual from, future, relationship, nonetheless, the get is chal, because mostly he is matir her to the rest of the world. And the Chachamim, we paskin like the Chachamim say, no, it doesn't work, because this is considered to be an incomplete divorce. By definition, a divorce, as we said before, means that all limitations imposed going forward have to end, have to be terminated. Okay, so that's a machlokas in the Mishnah.
Can I ask Rabbi, just a quick question?
Sure.
I don't know if we've ever spoken about this in the past, but why does the Mishnah use the language he's matir her? Isn't it the condition? It would almost seem like he just does krisus. There's no language like that in the Torah. He gives a krisus. Krisus implies maybe no to know him, or it's close to that, but it's not. He's determining that she's cut from him. But the language of that he would even say to begin with, that I'm matir you.
That's the typical language of a get. We'll see in a moment.
Okay.
The typical language of a get
is that a leap in any way, from the Mishnah and the Gemara itself that we're taking?
In the Mishnah itself, we find, and in the Nusach of Gittin, we find the typical language of a get is harei at muteres l'chol adam. He writes in the get.
But is that in the actual Torah?
No, I mean, the only thing that's in the Torah is
the krisus.
Because of, let's say, for krisus. But
it could easily be seen as, the bezdin, or is
right. But the language of the get from the earliest time that we're aware of it.
So we're taking this from the language that we know exists in the get.
Yeah.
As okay.
And the
Gemara
discusses it.
It's not even a question. It's not even a question to have needed to have that there might be a difference between his krisus and versus her being muteres l'chol adam.
I mean, you're asking whether the muteres l'chol olam is formulated as something that comes from him and from the get, or something that the bezdin does? Yeah, no, it's harei at muter. You're right. It's not in the writing of the Torah, but from the earliest, from the Mishnayos already, and from the Gemara, harei at muteres l'chol adam is the standard.
So we basically can go with the assumption that there's no space between the idea of krisus and harei at muteres. It's in his jurisdiction, so to speak. It's part of the language, or
it's part of the language, right? 100%.
Okay, so it's in the same.
But actually, we're going to be testing that a little bit tonight.
Okay, all right.
Let me say, because you're asking a good question, but the
typical
get is harei at muteres l'chol adam.
There is no assumption that he is matir her. That is to say that he is we're breaking he is breaking. Harei at muteres is a statement of fact, not a statement of the exercise of power.
It's not power. It's what a get is. A get. What we're going to discuss. What we're about to discuss is the relationship between two aspects of a get.
Okay.
Meaning the relationship that ends between her and her husband, right? And the potential that opens up to remarry anybody else. So we're going to be discussing, that's exactly what we're going to be discussing. But the point is that the typical nusach haget from the earliest time is harei at muteres l'chol adam. He writes, it's not a power that he has. It is, unless you think the get is a power.
No, exactly.
The definition of gittin.
No, but I wasn't so much thinking that it might be that he has the power, but it does seem a little bit unusual that when someone is doing something that's within the realm of a mitzvah, or that you describe to the other person in the transaction what the consequence will be. In other words, he doesn't say,
right. Why
doesn't he say, something with the word grusha? It as like kedushin. There's no parallel language to the kedushin where somebody says, I am begarish you. He doesn't say that. He talks about the consequence of what it'll be. And that just seems a little bit unusual. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Well, no, I don't think you're wrong. I think it's a good point, but you're maybe you're just underestimating. Meaning when you go into a marriage, and this is something that, kind of we're discussing, this is really the issue. Well, let me say it this way. When you go into a marriage, there are two components. One is, what takes place at the time of the Erusin, and
right.
Noaf brought it up last week. The Gemara says that the language of Kiddushin is the Osar Akula Alma Kehektish. Meaning when he marries her, he really says, Harei at Mekudeshes li. It's interesting, like he says, you become my wife, we now have a certain bond. But the word Kiddushin also signifies at the same time that she is now prohibited to the rest of the world. So really two things happen simultaneously, and it's legitimate, which I think you're going to the core of the question, which is like, first on the Isha side and then on the Gerushin side, there in both cases are two dimensions that classically and typically take place at the same time. In Kiddushin, in the Isha's part, it's she becomes my wife, and that opens, the door for a relationship. One second, a door for a relationship.
Yeah,
what?
Sorry. That's the parallelity of the language, is what you're saying.
Right, exactly.
Right, okay.
I mean, really what happens, if the Harei at Mukudeshes li refers to the relationship of husband and wife, but the language of Kiddushin that is used signifies that simultaneously, she becomes prohibited to the rest of the world.
And
maybe just one more second. There's also, remember, a time lag when it comes to the Isha's part, because first she becomes really Asura L'Kol Alma. Even though he says Harei at Mukudeshes li, she really becomes prohibited to the rest of the world first. She's not permitted to him until the Nisuin, until the second stage. Now, when it comes to the Gerushin, a classic Gerushin does the same thing, meaning also does two things in opposite directions. It terminates the Heter Isha Labal, right? And at the same time, it opens for her a potential future with the rest of the world. So, but the interesting thing is, what do you, and I think this is where you go on to something, what do you emphasize? If both of these things usually go together, are two questions. Can you ever split them up? And also, if you can split them up, so even when they go together, kind of which part triggers which? So in the language of Mekudeshes in marriage, really zeroes in on the rest of the world. But Harei at Mekudeshes li really starts with their relationship. When it comes to a get, typically Harei at Muteres L'Chol Adam, the language starts with the impact on the rest of the world. You don't usually say, hey, Harei at Mekureshes mimeni. That's what you're asking. The typical nusach is Harei at Muteres L'Chol Adam, whereas in Kiddushin it's Harei at Mekudeshes li. So in Kiddushin, we're talking about their bond, and in Gerushin, we're talking about, the heter to everybody else. But the question is, since these are two, can you ever split these two things up? That's what I'm going to discuss tonight. I'm going to discuss this very infamous, but but controversial tshuva of the author of the Lavush. I'll explain who he is in a minute. About the topic of tshuva me'ava. I made reference to it in previous weeks, but I wanted to get to it. So that's why.
What about the contingency of the children of the marriage? Does that come into?
What does that have to do with this right now?
The get, if he specifies how the children, for example, will be educated in the get.
No, I mean there are. Let me explain. The status of the children is very important. And that's not the subject matter of Masechet Gittin or of the get. That's the subject matter of Masechet Ketubot and the Ksuva contract. The Ksuva is what spells out, the broader relationships of husband and wife, while they're married, and also can contain clauses, that address. The question of either child support or who's going to live with who, those kind of things. But that, is not the focus of the divorce. The focus of the divorce, just like the focus of the marriage, is the relationship of husband and wife and the relationship to the rest of the world. The status of children and other financial issues. Remember, there are all sorts of financial entanglements between husband and wife. There's something called a nichse milug. There's something else called nichse tzon barzel. I mean, there are dowries. There are things that are brought into the marriage that, the husband has rights, of usage, but they remain the wife's. Whether or not, they're frozen in terms of the value. It's very complicated. It's a very serious. But that's the subject matter of Masechet Ketubot. That's really not the issue that is discussed in a get. That wouldn't be spelled out typically, in a get. That would be a matter that is, either dealt with, separately in terms of conditions. Again, like Jacob asked before, you can sometimes make a condition on a get, like I will give you this divorce on condition that, and that can maybe include issues having to do with childcare and child support and who's going to live where and so on and so forth. But those are extraneous to the get. I'm dealing with things that are intrinsic to the get. Namely, what is the relationship between husband and wife, and what is the relationship of the rest of the world? To what extent is she a free agent after the marriage? Okay, so let's get back to the Mishnah for a moment.
Where in the source sheet are we then at the moment?
We are on source sheet, the most recent one, and we are on page 2 of that source sheet. Does everybody have page 2? And I don't have the numbers, but it says Talmud Bavli. We're going to go back to the other parts in a minute. Masechet Gittin, Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Does everybody have that on the second page of the source sheet that was sent out last week, and that hopefully was sent out again this week, I hope. All right, everybody have it?
Yes.
If not, you can follow this part in the if you have a Gemara Gittin on it's a Mishnah, the first Mishnah in the 8th parak. I'm sorry, in the last parak, the 9th parak of Gittin. Okay. So Amagarish Ishto, a person divorces his wife. Amar lo yiseter harei at muteres l'chol adam. That's the typical nusach of a get. You are now free, from me, meaning you can now marry whoever you choose. Except here, he added 2 words, ela leploni, with the exception of, Mr. X, with the exception of Reuven. Right? You can't marry him. So Rabbi Eliezer Matir, Rabbi Eliezer says, listen, at least, he's being matir her for everybody else. There's a heter in the get, even though it isn't absolute. The Chachamim osrim, and the Chachamim disagree. They say that any holding any obstruction whatsoever when it comes to her ability to marry someone else, which is built into the get, not a separate condition. Whether what will happen in a second separate condition, that's a debate in the Gemara later on. That's what Jacob was kind of asking about. And that's, something that the Gemara discusses. However, this idea there being a remnant, of his control over her. The Chachamim reject it completely, and Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, as long as mostly she can remarry other people, she doesn't have to be able to remarry every single person. Okay, good. So far, so good. Now, if you continue to the next line, or if you're following the Gemara, then turn to the next page, the Gemara in Gittin, pay base, Amud base, towards the top, or the next line in the sheet. So the Gemara says the following: Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Talmud Rabbi Eliezer Mehacha. What's the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer? Why is he allowing a get in which there is an obstruction to her absolute freedom? Meaning, she can't marry anybody. She can marry, almost all people, but not one. Or let's say it was 50% of the world. It's hard to know where Rabbi Eliezer draws the line. Does he need some heter, but, or does he need everybody to be mutter except for one person? But why does Rabbi Eliezer think that that is an acceptable restriction? So the Gemara says an amazing thing. Talmud Rabbi Eliezer mehacha. The reasoning is the isha grusha me isha lo yikach. The Torah says that a Kohen cannot marry a divorcee. If somebody's a grusha, then a Kohen cannot marry her. Okay? Now again, make it clear. If a woman has been married before and her husband dies, she's widowed, then she can marry a Kohen. She cannot marry a Kohen Gadol. Right? That's usually not such a big problem, But a Kohen Gadol cannot marry an almana. But an almana can marry a Kohen, but a grusha cannot marry a Kohen. Somebody who's divorced cannot marry a Kohen. How do we know that? Because the pasuk says, the isha, grusha me isha. The second isha is with a mapik, meaning isha, ha-ish, shelah. So a woman who is divorced from her ish, from her husband, lo yikachu. A Kohanim cannot marry a divorcee, even if the get is perfectly proper. Nonetheless, that is a restriction, for Kohanim. So what's the idea here? Afilu lo nizgarsha. Why does the Torah use this expression? Why doesn't it just say isha grusha lo yikachu? Why does it say isha grusha me isha? Which sounds confusing anyway. That's why you have to emphasize that it has a mapik. The mapik means a dot in the hay, which implies a possessive, meaning her husband. So why do we need that extra word at all? Why not just say Isha grusha lo yikachu? You can't marry a divorcee. What do you mean you can't marry a divorcee from her husband? So listen to this. The Gemara says what you subtly learn from this usage, afilu lo nisgarsha elami isha nifsala mina kahuna. Even if we're not talking about a complete divorce, but merely a divorce that is partial. What do you mean partial? Let's say she's divorced. I said before in response to, the good doctor's question, right? That there are two components in marriage and there are two components in divorce. There's a relationship between these two individuals on the way in and on the way out. And there's also the impact that this has on the rest of the world, right? So let's say he divorces her by saying, you and I are divorced, but you can't marry anybody else. Okay? So what we're being told is that in that situation, a Kohen would not be able to marry her. Afilu lo nisgarsha elami isha, even if he says to her, Hare at megureshes mimeni, v'i at muteres, right? La'olam, you are divorced from me, but you are not allowed to marry anybody else. In that case, she can't marry a Kohen, even though in other respects the divorce is not binding. Nifsala mina kahuna. Says Rabbi Eliezer, Alma Habagita. We see that there can be a get in a circumstance where the focus is on ending or terminating the relationship with the previous husband, even though it doesn't also include what typically every get includes, and that is her permissibility to the rest of the world. Alma Habagita. The Rabbanan, what do the Rabbanan say about this? They don't buy it. So what's their counter argument? So it says the Gemara, Rabbanan, Isur Kahuna Shaini. It's true. When it comes to disqualifying her to marry a Kohen, this partial get, namely where there's a termination of the relationship of husband and wife, even though there's no additional license to get remarried, that would be enough to exclude her from any Kohen. That's called, by the way, it's called Reach HaGet. Reach here meaning like the smell, meaning it's like a quasi-get. It smells like a get, but it's not a full get because she can't remarry. So what we're saying is there's something called a Reach HaGet, and this Reach HaGet will apply even in a situation where there's a termination of the
sort of, ma'am. Can I call
even
you
if there's
back
not, in addition, a heter isha l'shuk. By the way, I should add, there's something very profound about all. Before I get to that, so one second. So basically, Rabbi Eliezer says, listen, if there was a requirement of, a complete heter isha l'shuk, then there probably wouldn't be an isur to a kohen when there was no aspect of heter isha l'shuk at all. What you see from Reach HaGet, even though it's applying to kahuna, is that the concept of a half a get, if you want to call it that, or a one-dimensional get that focuses on the termination of the relationship rather than the permissibility to the rest of the world, that's possible. And the Chachamim, we paskin like the Chachamim, they say, no, this is that's a unique disqualification of a Kohen. Outside of kahuna, there is no half get. There's no get that, establishes a termination of the relationship of husband and wife if it doesn't also include a heter, not just a heter, but a heter for everybody. That's the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Now, I just wanted to mention, Agav, there's something important about all this, meaning there's an important implication here about, there's a very important implication here about why it is that a Kohen and a Grusha cannot be married. It has nothing to do with the fact that she, was previously married, because then that would apply to an almana as well as a Grusha. That would apply to a widow as well as a divorcee. Why is a Kohen not allowed to marry a Grusha? Because the breakup of her first marriage is the problem. The fact that her first marriage ended in divorce, right, that's what disqualifies the Kohen. Meaning, it has to do with the fact that she had, an unhappy previous relationship. There's a certain, more idealistic, I guess, structurally anyway, expectation for the marriage of a Kohen. For a Kohen Gadol even more, he's only allowed to marry somebody who was never married before. But for a Kohen Hedja, we don't go that far. But somebody who has been sadly, through the experience of a divorce, right, that person cannot be the wife of a Kohen. So when you think about it, which aspect of divorce is critical for the disqualification for a Kohen? Is it the termination of the relationship of husband and wife, or is it her license to marry going forward? Clearly, it's the termination of the original relationship and the scars that leads. Because if it was a license going forward, there's no difference between a Grusha and an Almana in terms of a Kohen. So it's very meduyak. This is, no one else is saying this, but to me, this is just an important point to bring out. When the Torah wants to tell you that a Kohen cannot marry a Grusha, it says, the Isha Grusha me Isha lo yikachu. It emphasizes, the aspect of the sad way the first marriage with the first husband ended, instead of zeroing in on, Harayat Muteris L'chal Adam, which is what most Gittin, concentrate and focus on. Okay.
Is it also because, and maybe this is the same thing, in the case of the Grusha, the original husband is still alive, and he is the one that created her being mutter to the Kohen, and we can't allow that. That's really.
Let's say he's not alive, and it doesn't matter if he's still alive. I mean, the fact that he was.
No, but in Almana, she's alone in the world, so she can marry the Kohen. But because she had, there's nothing holding her back from the Kohen having a successful kedushin.
I mean, right? But would you say that? Let's say the Kohen. Let's say there's a grusha, and then the husband dies. Is there still going to be a prohibition?
Because the initial way she entered into was through mutaras. You are mutaras l'chol adam. There was her freedom.
So I hear what you're saying.
Her status was initiated by him, and we're always worried about that somehow. Even though, like for the head yod, it's okay. We got to live in the world. Right. But when we get to be a Kohen, we could be more choosy.
Right. It's not so dissimilar from what I'm saying.
I'm saying, is that another way of saying what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different, but it's on the same wavelength. What we're both trying to figure out or zero in on is something that makes, something that adds like a complexity, or something that, kind of poisons the idealism, or compromises the idealism of this future marriage. You're saying it's the fact that almost like, the husband is a factor in her freedom, the previous husband. And I'm saying it's more like the unhappy way that, that marriage.
Right.
Ended.
Well, but
I think
the unhappiness and the presence of the husband is not so far apart.
Right. No, I think it's
so. Yeah, I was saying, is it another way of saying what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is.
So it would suggest that there's a stigma to a grusha, and if that's the case, from what you're saying, it would seem, what is the character of that stigma?
No, I don't think it's a stigma at all. By the way, not a stigma, but more of an assessment. Not a stigma. Stigma has a connotation of like somebody did something wrong, and then the value of the individual has been compromised. Khalil, I don't think that's true at all. Let me say that very strongly. I don't think so at all. But what I do think is that there's a practical kind of assessment that somebody who has gone through that experience. Remember, our previous topic was grounds for divorce, and we're talking about how in a way. The institution of divorce, sadly, is a sad but necessary investment in happy marriages. So that people feel that they're free and they can make choices, and this is a way for them, to feel more confident, because they don't feel trapped, and so on and so forth. So it's not a stigma, but obviously any marriage that ends in a divorce is a trauma that psychologically needs to be overcome. By the parties involved, and the idea that there might be more baggage, in what you want, and I agree with David completely. In the more idyllic, Kohen, relationship, is a problem. With an almana, again, there's obviously that's a sad situation too. But people have, let's say, all things being equal, structurally, there was a good marriage, it was a happy marriage. Her experience in marriage was good. We don't know that it was in every individual case, but we're talking about structurally, and therefore there's no impediment, in marrying a Kohen. But for somebody who's had to undergo the trauma of a failed marriage, there's no stigma at all, but there is a loss of, let's say an idyllic or an ideal, kind of perspective towards marriage, which is a prerequisite, let's say, for marrying a Kohen, who's going to spend his life, also in a very idealistic.
But an almana is traumatic also. I don't understand.
It's a different kind of trauma. That's all I'm trying to say.
What is a trauma? But it's a trauma.
I'm sorry?
It's a different type of
You're breaking up.
But it's a trauma.
It is a trauma. It's a different kind of trauma. Yeah.
It's not a man. It's not a man-made trauma.
In one case, it's a trauma, that has to do with a soured, having experienced a marriage, that's soured. So that trauma relates to, in many cases, how people perceive, the institution itself, and that's something, which can have impact on a future. And in the other case, it's the trauma of human loss, which is a terrible tragedy, but it's not it doesn't reflect, any sense of lack of confidence or lack of idealism about the experience of marriage. Right?
It's man-made. The trauma is man-made in the case of Grusha. It's sort of a Bein Adam v'Chavero.
Yeah, but it's even more than that. It's man-made and it's marriage-made.
Right. But
therefore, it's more of a problem for a Kohen than Almana, the people that are very successful marriage.
Honestly, I think it's just cleaner to say a Kohen has to marry a Basula, and then
you could say that, but what you're saying is against the Psukim in Chumash.
Well, for a Kohen Gadol, I'm right. So a Kohen Hedjot, I'm wrong.
We're talking about a Kohen Hedjot, so where you're
right.
wrong.
But distinguishing between death
but
and
we
divorce
do. That's
is
the
kind of,
halakha.
I know it's complicated.
It's complicated, but this is
because they're different traumas. So
yeah.
Torah is saying when someone
the
dies,
trauma of divorce
is
something
that could be more traumatic. By the way, a lot of people would rather go out with someone who's divorced than someone who's happily married and the husband died. Because
no one's forcing anybody to marry anybody. So no one's forcing anybody to marry anybody. So in the end of the day, this Kohen Hedjot is not going to marry somebody who doesn't, who he's not convinced, is appropriate for him.
Yeah, but he can be fooled.
We're not playing, we're not psychoanalyzing them. We're just trying to understand what the halakha itself is.
We actually are. We're psychoanalyzing the difference between death and divorce. That's what we're doing. We're psychoanalyzing, and we're saying death is not so traumatic and divorce is.
No, we're not saying that at all. I don't think we said that. I'm not talking about the degree of trauma. I'm talking about the nature of trauma. What I'm saying is that we start off with the facts. The facts are that the Kohen Hedjot can marry an almana. He can't marry a grusha. That's fact number one. Fact number two is that when the Torah formulates that halacha, it does so in a manner that is different than every other reference to divorce in the Torah. Namely, it does so by emphasizing the poisoned relationship with the previous husband, rather than talking objectively about the fact that she is divorced. That's the pasuk that we're quoting. Isha grusha me isha lo yikachu. That's the emphasis. That's fact number two. Fact number three is that he is permitted to marry an almana. And what we're trying to not psychoanalyze, but we're trying to understand is that while the trauma of losing a loved one and the trauma of going through divorce are both enormous difficulties, they are different. They're fundamentally different. In one case, the issue is, can you replace, a beloved, spouse? And that's one kind of a challenge. You can't really replace. Can you move on from that? Or is there always comparisons, et cetera, et cetera? And in the other case, the point is that you had an unhappy experience in marriage. And the question is, does that, poison your perspective on marriage, with consequences, for, an individual like who's already leading a very, formally a very idealistic kind of life. So it's just they're
why
different.
Is a Kohen Gadol prohibited from marrying an almana?
No, Kohen Gadol, because he, if we're discussing, if we could have conceived of the possibility, that any Kohen might have been prohibited from marrying an almana, so then certainly we can understand that is an additional aspect of Kohen Gadol. There are many things that a Kohen Gadol, is one notch higher than a Kohen Hedjot in terms of the idealism of his position. Min hamikdash lo yetze, he's makriv onein. There are 20 halachos that establish that a Kohen Gadol isn't just the titular head of the Kohanim. He's the one who's nichnas lifnai v'lifnim on Yom Kippur. So the idea that for him, you don't even want to chance the comparison to a previous happy marriage, is totally understandable. But again, we're working backwards. We're not making these are halachos that are psukim in the Chumash, and that are halachos in the halacha. A Kohen Gadol cannot marry even an almana, and a Kohen Hedjed can marry an almana, but cannot marry a grusha. But the way that the Torah describes that in a fascinating way is to emphasize not the fact that she per se is divorced, but the fact that the divorce reflects a failure in the first relationship between her and her husband. Isha grusha me isha lo yikachu. Anyways, the principle of reach haget, I should just mention, is a really fascinating topic. I mean, this idea that typically if you want to divorce, only vis-a-vis the parties themselves, harei at migureshes mimeni, but without granting any kind of license for the rest of the iat muteras l'chol adam, the idea that creates a psul kahuna, even though it's not a proper gerushin, more broadly, is a remarkable halacha. So you should be aware. I should have put this on the Marmakomos, but I did not. Just give me one second. Just 1 second. A Rambam in Perek Yud of Hilchos Gerushin seems to suggest that this din of reach haget, not the general din of Kohen not being allowed to marry grusha, that's minat Torah, that's verses in the Torah, but the din of reach haget, that if he tries to partially divorce her, meaning he ends their relationship, even though he doesn't provide the opportunity for her to marry anyone else, that is sufficient to disqualify kahuna. The Rambam says that's a din d'Rabbanan. Okay, I'll just read you the lines. This is Perek Yud Halacha Aleph. The Rambam says here, the imaya bala kohen. It's talking about a case of a person who tries to divorce but does so improperly, so inadequately, so the divorce is not binding. Imaya bala kohen, if her husband was a kohen, lo nesra alav mishum grusha. Like if you try to divorce orally, like you say, "Oh, we're finished. I'm taking away your keys. Our marriage is terminated," but you don't give her a proper get. It's not lishma. You don't give a ksab at all. You don't write the right things. So that doesn't do anything. It doesn't even disqualify for a kohen. However, chutz min hamagaresh es ishto, except for the case where he divorces his wife, the Amar Larni says to her, "Harei at migureshes mimeni. You are divorced from me. Our relationship is terminated. The ein at muteres l'chol adam. However, you don't have license to marry other people either." This is the Rambam now. Sha'afal pi she'ein zeh get, even though it's not a proper get because he isn't giving her, the license to remarry. So from a gittin point of view, it's not a proper get. Harezu psula lekahuna, but then the Rambam adds the words midivreim. Midivreim in the Rambam means midrabanan. It's only a rabbinic law. The disqualification of the Kohen when there's only a partial get, namely termination of their relationship, but not license to remarry, the Rambam says that's only drabanan. Although it's curious that he quotes a pasuk for this, and the same pasuk, shenemar v'isha grusha me'isha, right? Omru chachamim afilu lo nizgarsha ela me'isha. Even if he only terminates their relationship, below hutra lekol, and he didn't permit her for everyone else, nesra lekahuna. She is prohibited lekahuna. V'zehu reach haget. That's what the famous institution of reach haget, the smell of a get, meaning a quasi get, is. Sheposel b'kahuna, and he repeats again, mi divrehem, because it disqualifies her, but only rabbinically. However, the position of the Rambam is logically understandable. Like, what kind of thing is that? Either a get is a get, or it's not. If you need heter, isha, l'shuk to qualify for a proper gerushin, then anything less than that, why is that even posa l'kahuna, right? So the Rambam said, yeah, you're right. The whole thing is drabana. It's only a rabbinic enactment. However, the simple reading of the Gemara that we just read is not that way, because the argument in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, once again, can he give her divorce and say, you can marry anybody in the world, all marriageable, proper, no relatives, and of course only Jews, and the whole
this
bit.
One guy.
Just except for one guy. So Rabbi Eliezer said that's good, and the Chachamim said it's not good. How did Rabbi Eliezer prove that it was good? From Reach HaGet. How can you prove that? And then the Chachamim said, what did the Chachamim say? Shiny kahuna, that's a special din in kahuna. So obviously Rabbi Eliezer is speaking about a din d'oraisa, a biblical law. How can he prove from Reach HaGet if Reach HaGet is only d'Rabbanan? So the Rashba, right, on Daf Pei Daled Amud Beis, a couple of dapim later, says, I quotes the Rambam, who says that it's only midivrayim. He says, I disagree with him completely. I think that the din of Reach HaGet, namely that a Kohen cannot marry a woman who was half divorced. I'm going to say now half divorced. I mean by half divorced, meaning where the relationship of husband and wife was terminated, but nothing else, no license was granted, says the Rashba. In my opinion, legabe psul kahuna, the disqualification for a Kohen, that is minat Torah. There are two gittin. There's a get that works, in all other realms, and there's a get that disqualifies her for a Kohen. I was trying to explain before, not hopefully psychoanalyzing, but trying to reconstruct what the halacha, thinks about, grusha. That if this is a din d'oraisa, isha grusha me isha, it doesn't require a full divorce. It requires a toxic termination of the first relationship that she had. That's what the psukim say. The isha grusha me isha, again with a mapik, a woman who's divorced from her husband, even if the divorce isn't complete because she can't marry anybody else, and therefore there are no other consequences, right? Going that stage of it, right, is sufficient to disqualify her for a Kohen. Okay? Then remember, the Chachamim disagree. We paskin like the Chachamim. So you could say, no problem for the Rambam. He'll just say, you're right. Rabbi Eliezer obviously thinks that Reach HaGet, this half gerushin, is minat Torah. It disqualifies for kahuna minat Torah. However, we don't paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, but that doesn't work so well either, because what did the Chachamim say to Rabbi Eliezer's proof? They didn't say, what do you bring the proof from Reach HaGet? It's only rabbinic. What did they say? They said, shiny kahuna. That's a special application to Kohanim. It has nothing to do with the idea that you could have any kind of compromise on the heter isha labala vis-a-vis the get going forward. They didn't say it's rabbinic. They said, you're right, it's biblical, but even though it's biblical, it's a special din in Kohanim. So if you look at the Nosei Kalim on the Rambam, it's very interesting. Some of them say, you know what? That's what he meant, shiny kahuna. He meant this Kohen thing isn't real. This Kohen thing is a rabbinic enactment. Or they meant, even if you think that the Kohen thing is d'oraisa, even then it's only a Kohen thing. We happen to think that the Kohen thing is only d'Rabbanan anyway. So everybody is scrambling and struggling to try to interpret, how could the Rambam have said that Reach HaGet, that this disqualification for kahuna could take place in a quasi-get that doesn't work for anything else? How can you say that? It's against the Shaklavatari, the Gemara that we just read. So these are the efforts that they make. But most of the Mefarshim embrace the position of the Rashba. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch and Ibn Ezer, when they quote Reach HaGet, they quote the language of the Rambam and they omit the word midivrayim. Everything else of the Rambams they quote.
So this
influential.
quasi get, this reach haget
Yeah.
that you are describing for us sounds like a verbal event. And
it's not a verbal event.
It's clear from the Torah that everything has to be sifrei
Sefer Krisos.
Krisos.
It's not a verbal event. It's not a verbal event.
So how do you write a partial? How do you write a partial get
the text
and then rewrite it again to make it a complete get?
No, you don't. You don't. You'd have to make a new get. The text that we're talking about is written in the get. It says, "Harei at migureshes mimeni, ve'ein at muteres l'chol adam." That's what the Gemara describes. That's what I'll read it from the Rambam again. Hamagarish asishto ve'amar la. This is what he means. Amar la doesn't only mean verbal. Here, this is also written in the get. Harei at migureshes mimeni. The ein at muteres l'chol adam. That's the text. Afal pi she'ein ze get, even though it's only a half a get because he doesn't free her. Harei ze psula l'kahuna midivrei. So when the Shulchan Aruch writes this over, they write Harei ze psula l'kahuna, and they take out the word midivrei. Okay.
So there is more than one type of get, in other words.
Yeah, but the typical effective get, just to make it very, very clear, meaning this din of reach haget might be biblical, might be rabbinic. Even if it's biblical, mostly it's limited to the consequence of disqualifying her for kahuna. But any get that's going to be effective in any other way certainly requires harei at muteres l'chol adam. However, there's one exception, and that's what I want to talk about now. Okay. And that is maybe the institution, the dubious institution of what's called get me'ava, a person who gives a divorce out of love. What does that mean? We'll explain in a moment. I mean, he doesn't divorce because of anger or because of toxic relationship. He divorces because there are dire circumstances, and he wants to protect the interests of his wife. For example, he's going out to battle.
To war.
Or he is ill, right? They don't have any children. And for whatever reason, but there are many good reasons.
He wants to protect her from the brother.
He wants to protect her from Yibum and Chalitza, correct. So he says, listen, I don't, nothing is more precious to me than our marriage, except maybe your happiness, right? So he divorces her with the intention of, saving her, from either aguna, right, or from shalotipal kame yavam, or from a yibam and chalitza situation. Can that happen? Of course it can happen, right? It doesn't happen every day. It's not the typical divorce case, but it's something that for sure happens and has happened. What would happen in that case? Is there such a category of get me'ava or not? So we had this already a little bit in the following application. When we were talking about whether there's a mitzvah lagaresh under any conditions, is there ever a mitzvah to? So we said, there can be conditions. Let's say the behavior of the parties in the marriage is inappropriate. Mitzvah lagaresh. But I think I mentioned that in the Sefer Mitzvahs of Rab Saadia Gaon, the author of that work, not Rab Saadia Gaon, but the person who wrote the commentary, so he found in the, again, you have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt, but he found in the formulations or the poetry of Rab Shlomo ibn Gaviro, he seemed to say that he counted the mitzvah of Gerushin twice. And the question is why twice? What are the twice? So he said, if you look in the Parsha, in Kitetze, it's usnea ha'ish. That's a get out of hate, out of breakdown of a relationship. But maybe there's another get, as we're discussing now, and that's of Ava. So the mitzvah lagaresh out of sinna is if there's a breakdown in the standards, in the loyalty of husband and wife, then they have to get divorced. That's one situation. But what if there's no breakdown, an excellent relationship? Ad kedei kach that he wants to protect her because he's going out to war or because he's ill. Is there a mitzvah like so that the theory of Rabbi Yerucham Frischel Perlo is that Rabbi Shlomo Even Gavirol has two different mitzvos legarish. Okay. It's really based on a tshuva of the Levush, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Before I get to that, I also want to note that the Netziv, in his Perish Hameg Davar, if you could turn back to the first page of these Marmakomos just for a minute, the bottom of page 1. So the Netziv was troubled by the words in the Parsha and Kitetse, V'shilcha. He said, why didn't the Torah say V'girsha? Right? So this is, if you look at Hameg Davar, Achein imkein v'hotzia, o V'girsha mibeisa mibai. Why does the Torah say V'shilcha? Could have said, you could have used the verbs, hotzia, right? He evicts her, o girsha, and divorces her from his home, right? Demashmos, shilach, hulertzono. The Netziv argues, I think it's questionable, that the word shilach or shalach is always implies out of consent, not forcibly. So he says, why does the Torah dafka speak about divorce in terms of consent? Kamo v'shalach alchem es achechem acher v'shilachtam l'nafsha v'chein harbe elamiz elamadnu, says the Netziv. It's a little hint. The yesh gerushin machmas shehi rotza b'kach shechosheshes le'igun o le'yibam v'chalitza v'chadome al zek siv v'shilcha hainu l'nafsha uritzona. Not so much the whole parsha in Kitetse, but it's fascinating that Netziv says that the Torah used a verb to convey that in addition to the typical divorce, which is a very unhappy, reflects an unhappy relationship, there's also a divorce out of affection, a constructive divorce, to avoid yibum or igun. So, whether it's possibly Rab Shlomo Even Gavirol or it's that it Netziv's remez, the idea that, there is a circumstance of divorce that comes out of love and affection, and concern, is according to some, registers either in the language of the Torah, right, or in the halakha, etc. But none of this is anything close to what I'm about to share with you. Because so far, these are like, conditions, circumstances. There's no hint in the Netziv, and in many of the other Makoros, that the motivation for a divorce has impact on the content or the quality, right, or the protocols of the divorce. A divorce is a divorce. We're just talking about motivation. Why are you doing it, right? This is where the Levush comes in. So Levush, everybody, should be familiar. Reb Mordechai Yaffa, that was his name. He was, again, a 16th century halachist, a contemporary of the Shulchan Aruch. In fact, he wrote, we call him the author of the Levush, because he wrote a sefer called Levush Malchus, which was a kind of a Shulchan Aruch. And, he was contemporary of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote what we call the Shulchan Aruch. And, there's a whole issue, about publishing it, because Rabbi Yosef Karo, they were basically working on it at the same time. They were contemporaries, kind of. So Rabbi Mordechai Yaffa is like a very well-known authority, and his book, Levush Malchus, also on the Seder of the Tur, just like the Shulchan Aruch, is a very well-known work and a very oft-quoted work. Anyways, so he was involved in a case. This is a tshuva that I want to just, in the little time that we have left, talk about very quickly. But if you turn to page 2, there's a tshuva that appears in the Shelos Utshuvos of the Maram Milublin, also from the 16th century, Simin Kufchav Gimel. I'll just tell you the background of the story, and then we'll read the contribution of the Levush. The background of the story is it was this I think it's in Vienna, this took place. There was a marriage between, I forget, they have the names here, we get them in the end, but 16-year-old, Plony married, I don't know how old, Almonis, he married, Reuven married Sarah. Reuven was 16 years old at the time, and he was diagnosed with a terrible illness, okay? A life-threatening illness. So out of concern and affection, for his young bride, who he had just, married recently, right? He was trying to figure out a way, to move forward with all of this. Anyways, before he knew it, he was, besieged by the relatives of the bride, his new in-laws. And they basically said to him, listen, you should divorce her, because if you die, there's going to be a problem of yibum, etc. So you should divorce her. Listen, if you recover, then you'll remarry her. But because again, there's not going to be an intervening marriage, presumably. So you can, remarry her. But for now, you should divorce her to protect her interests. Okay. So that's what happened. This, young chassan caring about his, equally young bride. So he divorced her. And then he went for, good medical treatment. He sought out the, I guess, the most capable physicians of the land. And woe and behold, they cured him. Baruch Hashem. So his terminal illness, right? Or it wasn't, again, there was a chance that he would recover, obviously. It turns out that he's, going to live ad mea v'esrim, hopefully. So then he, he goes back to the family very triumphantly, ready to, remarry, his bride. And, they've already found like a better candidate for her. So they're not so interested anymore in this remarriage. So basically they said, listen, you divorced her. We did say, that, if all things work out that, you can remarry her, but not in a way that undermined, the integrity of the get, or that was a t'nai, a condition of the get. And therefore, sorry, but, we've decided, she's decided, the family's decided, to move on. We're very happy that you're healthy. I don't know if they said that part or not, but, you're not, anymore going to be part of our family. So he was very devastated. He felt that he had been, played, I guess. And this is a din Torah that came up in the community. The question is, can she, she has this divorce, but it was given, under kind of shady circumstances. Can she move on if she wishes? Or is it a get betos? Is it a, some sort of a illegal get?
Why couldn't she move on? I don't understand. Isn't it a real divorce? I don't understand the question.
The question is whether or not all the, promises and qualifications, that the family had agreed to, were they sufficiently binding, or was his get given, with the clear understanding, that there would be a remarriage if he recovered, or no, those are like extraneous.
But in all due respect, if you do that, it's not a real get. It's no strings attached, we said earlier. So if he thinks he can divorce her and then have an option to have her back, that's not a get. That's
you can give a get. No. It's not. That is not correct. You can give a get al tanai. You can impose a condition on a get. You just can't impose a condition on a get that allows the get to be chal and the previous husband to still pull the strings. Those are two different things.
But just to be clear, if it's a real get, she's free to do what she wants.
If it's the
get.
The question is, was it a real get, or was he tricked into giving a get? In which case, his das lagarish is incomplete. There were actually three.
So it's like a mechaktos, like a
mechaktos, either a mechaktos or a kind of implicit tanai. Exactly. What you're talking about before, and what we were talking about before about, there not being, it being a sefer davar kores b'no lebeina, that means that if there's a divorce, he can't continue to put, to impose, limitations on her, in terms of who she can marry and things of that sort, or maybe even other, limitations. But whether the divorce will be binding or the conditions that the divorce will take place, that is a concept of tanai. There's a tanai, you can make a tanai or a ta'os in a get. So basically, the chassan was claiming that it was a ta'os, and those who sided with the rest of the family were saying, listen, we had an understanding. We were telling him that this was our intention, but it didn't reach the level of a t'nai or a ta'os, and therefore she's divorced. The Maram Lublin, who is, it's in his chuvas that this all appears, he took the position that he thought it was a ta'os, and he was railing against the those who sided with the family, saying that this is not a proper divorce. She's really an Eshes Ish. They're still married, etc. The Levush, who I've been talking about, came up with a totally different perspective. His perspective is the following. I'll just tell you what he says, and then I'll show you inside some of the language. The whole thing is very fascinating. Again, the Levush is a major authority, and what he came up with is follows. He said, listen, there's an institution called Reach HaGet that we were just talking about, meaning I called it before like a half get, meaning one-dimensional get, a get vis-a-vis the relationship, but not vis-a-vis the license to remarry, right? So we know that this works to disqualify for kahuna. Let's assume that for a moment that it's a biblical law, like most Rishonim, like the Rajba, not like the Rambam, right? Says the Levush, I don't think it's only applicable to kahuna. I think that it's mostly applicable to kahuna, but it reflects an actual category of get. And maybe it applies when there's a get me'ava. Why? Because when he divorces her, in order to save her, what is he really trying to do? He's trying to make sure, right, that there'll be no yibum. There's only going to be yibum if he's still her husband. But if he cancels the relationship between the two of them, right, so that he's no longer her husband, right, then there's no din of yibum, because yibum is lahakim zera la'achiv, achiv of who? Achiv of the husband, hames. But he's not her husband anymore. So in addition, this is the argument of the Levush. She said there is the fact that there's a disqualification for a Kohen when there's a termination of the relationship, even in absence of a heter, l'kol ha'olam, shows you that there is such a get. The only thing it has very limited impact, right? It doesn't allow her to get remarried to anybody else, because basically they said, Hareat megureshes mimeni ve'ein at muteres l'chol adam. But it has not one consequence, but two consequences. One is isha grusha me isha lo yikachu. It disqualifies her from kahuna. But the second consequence is, since he's no longer her husband, even though she's not muteres l'shuk, there's no yibum and there's no chalitza. And therefore, why would he do this me'ava? Because of this contingency. He doesn't want to divorce her. He doesn't want her to marry anybody else. He just wants to make sure that if he dies, that she won't have a problem of yibum. Now, of course, if he dies, she can marry whoever she wants anyway, without the yibum. If he doesn't die, then they can continue. Then he can marry her again, because she can't marry anybody else in between. So I want to show you this inside. Look at this on page 2.
So what was the happening of the girl's family to get remarried if that was the case?
I mean, they were stringing him up. I mean, why did they say that?
Yeah, well, if they knew that there was already that condition built in.
I think the implication from the Marmalubin and others that they were stringing him along. They wanted him to give a divorce so she would be free,
But
either then they might have been
but,
sincere then, and then later on, like a better prospect, showed up, or maybe he didn't conduct himself well when he was ill. Or
so they
maybe
wanted to have another. So they wanted to complete the divorce at that point. They knew that she was not Muteres L'Cholada.
Yeah, they were saying, listen, this is a proper divorce. Whether they changed their mind or they misled him or they.
No, I'm not saying the motivation. What is it that they were requesting? That he give them that he rewrite it, that he do a new divorce, a real.
Did he give her a complete divorce?
A sefer krisis he wanted. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but we don't know in this. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So yeah, you're right. I mean, in a way, I think I get what you're asking. The Levush said, listen, it doesn't matter what the text of the get is here, because if it was given me'ava, then implicitly, it has the status of a get of grusha me'isha, but not haret muteres l'cholada.
Got
That, which is fascinating. So everybody happy with the shoot? I'm just going to take a couple of minutes just to read some of this, because this is a classic. This became a cause celeb in Lublin, by the way. I think Maram lost his job because of this, because he was so upset with the other Rabbanim. And then the Levush, just created this new category. Later on, Rabbi Yerucham Fishel Perlo, when he wrote the Sefer Mitzvah Sajagon, said that he thinks that this category that the Levush discovered is really implicit in the Gaonim and others. He has some interesting Bar Makomos. He thought this is like, the mainstream view. But it's tamua. It's really shocking in a way. But it's a fascinating chapter, and it's also a fascinating phenomenon, this idea of a one-dimensional get, a get me'ava, which works...
Like a mercy divorce. It's a mercy divorce.
Like a mercy divorce. So, but they're saying that the mercy divorce only works to eliminate the husband and what his status imposes in terms of requirements. It doesn't actually free her because it's only a partial divorce. Right. So listen to this. This is the Shut Maram Kuf Kav Gimel. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. This person who was ill and he gave a get. The rabbis who said that she's divorced, she can do whatever she wants. The kodim shigil liyodo davar chuvasi kasher hu hakol mevura b'davarav v'afal pikein lo hitir ha'isha hanizkeres li'alma afilu beget sheni. The Levush paskind, because again, the normal psak would be either it's a good get and she can marry whoever she wants, and maybe they did him wrong by misleading him, but still a get's a get. Or the view of the Maram Lublin, which was they tricked him. This is not a proper get because it's a get betos, and therefore she's completely married to him. The Levush came up with this compromise and said, no, this is a get me'aba, because that's why he gave it. They're divorced from each other, but she was never muteris to marry anybody else. She could only remarry him, or she can stay in aguna. Why? Because he can't give her a second divorce at this point either, because he's no longer her husband.
That's the wrinkle here.
That's the wrinkle. Now, again, if it's really me'ava and they're all playing according to the rules, so what? She wants to remarry him, because they have a good relationship. So he's freed her from Yibum, right? But he doesn't need to free her for the rest of the world because they want to continue their marriage anyway. But the idea that he's so out of the picture that he couldn't even give her a divorce for the rest of the world at this point because he's not in the picture. He's not the husband, but she's in limbo, so she can remarry him. That's what the Levush actually said. Look at the language.
It's a male laguna.
What? It is, except that so he says if this was a get me sinna, you could never do it. He says because the Torah would never allow it because. Dirachel Darche Noam. Torah would never allow this out of hate.
But this guy's, I'm saying, but inadvertently he becomes a male aguna. He's trapped.
She's trapped.
But he's trapped also. With regards to this marriage. Only.
Yes. So listen to the language. Ava became lo hiter ha'isha nizkeres li'alma. He wouldn't permit her to get married to other people. Afilu beget sheni, even if the husband were now to give him a second get. Why? The only option she has before, unless he dies, is for her to remarry him. This is the Maram Leblin saying about the Lavush. Once he saw all my evidence that it was a trick anyway, so then he said, "Oh, it's just a trick." But he didn't really do that, actually. If you look at the Tshuva, so but anyway, look at the second piece. This is the Lavush writing. He said, "When I heard of this story, when I heard this whole story, he said, I was thunderstruck. I was shocked. Ala shmua, belibi boer kaesh. And I was like furious. It's just a great, amazing thing. He says, my heart, was burning with anger. Al ktsas rabbanim shehela belibam lahaktis Yisrael v'lahatelem chumras me'eshasish v'harbos mamzerim b'Yisrael chalila v'chalila. He says, I can't believe that these other poskim said that she could just get married and that this is a proper get, and they're being mater and eshasish with, if there are children from the next marriage, it's not a real marriage, they'll be mamzerim. V'hitzikasni ruach bitni v'amarti leman Tzion lo echashed. This is like a play, it's just so clever. V'leman Yerushalayim lo eshkod, right? I won't be silent for the sake of Tzion and Yerushalayim. Ritzoni lomar, now he's darshaning it. Leman Yisrael hamitzuyonim b'mitzvos chamuros. See, for the excellent, Jewish people who are so careful about mitzvos. Lo echasha, I won't be silent. Leman kahal Hashem hatrichim leiraos shalem. The tachlis hashlemus, to act, honestly and mitzada yichus lo eshkot v'lo aniach mila hashiv al dvaram v'lechavos daiti legalos ta'usam, to show how they're wrong. V'dimyonom begitin sheim dimyonam she'enam amitiyim ve'lem dimyon emes b'seichel. So now, Skip, I made a mistake just where I put everything. But if you go to the next entry, he bases it all on the previous topic that we did about grounds for divorce. Listen how he talks about that just for a minute. Again, I'm going to finish up in 5 minutes. Everybody have it? Lahim sheila gdola.
What about the pasuk in the Torah? He divorced his wife. The
perfect. So he says, you know what? There are two parshios in the Torah. One parsha is v'holcha v'hoysel isha acher. That's what it also says in that parsha, usneya ha'isha acharon. That's a get misina. He says in a get misina, it's all or nothing. If you end the relationship, you can only end the relationship by being matir isha l'shuk. Because it says exactly what you just said, v'yatza v'hoysa l'isha acher. But he says there's another parsha of Gittin.
That should be part of the get.
Right. But there's another parsha of Gittin, and that's the din of Reach HaGet. What does it say there? Isha grusha me isha lo yikachu. That's a get that's focused only on the ending of the first relationship. That's how he's reading the psukim. So there are two different parshios. Let's look at it very quickly. Achakdim lahem shelah gdola v'hiklu alakol. It says, Ki yadua umuforsam Mishnah Shlema. Everybody knows the last Mishnah in Gittin. Shehi B'sof Gittin, Daf Tzadi. Everybody have this, by the way? For me, it's on bottom of page 2. Starts from the words, Shut Maram Melublin, that another one. Ach Akdim Lahem Sheila Gedola, Uhi Klula. Got it?
Yeah.
He says, everybody knows the last Mishnah in Gittin. Beis Shammai Lo Yigarish Adam Esishto, Elam Kein Matzah Ervas Davar. Beis Hillel says, Afilu ikdicha tavshilo, right? Even if you burnt the stew. Midalo amar osel garish leishto mashma halashon lo yigarish adam ishto shubederach etza tova. Avalim rotzel garish afilu below mitzias ervas tavar yachal garish. He says it sounds like the Mishnah is saying that these are the proper reasons to get divorced. But if you choose to get divorced, even against the wisdom of the Torah, the divorce will be chal. He says vani meyom umdi al daiti. Listen to the language, just amazing. He says, from the earliest time I can remember that I was an independent thinker, hayisi mishtomeim, right, umatmia, I was shocked, and horrified, alzo samishna. Shemash mutav shafilum below mitzias ervas davar yakal agarish. You can get divorced for burning the stew. Mehechel lamdu lomar kain. How did they come to that conclusion?
We talked about that. It was intentional. We talked about this. The stew was intentional, symptomatic of something else.
Good. But we're now, we have a little window into the mind of the Levush. The Levush didn't have the schus of hearing our shiurim in our discussions. So he's telling you his thought process on exactly the same issue, right? That's what's so fascinating about it. This is the 16th century Levush giving you his reaction to the Mishnah.
Free Sigmund Freud.
What?
Free Sigmund Freud.
It's not Sigmund Freud. It says, how does he's saying, like, how could this be? Right? Maybe dafka, maybe the only way to ever justify a divorce is if the marriage is objectively, destroyed. After all, kasav l'sefer krisa shekain mashma lashon hapasuk. Avalim lo matza ervas davar shema get ene koris b'neim. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it'll take too long. So his answer is, if you skip down now from there, I'm already on page 3, skip down like 13 more lines. So he says, the difference is that there are 2 parshios of get. Exactly what I was answering to my Ra. The Parshat Kitetse is people who get divorced because of rancor, because their relationship sours, and they get divorced. Usneya ha'isha acharon, and that requires biyatza v'haisa le'isha acher. You can't terminate, the relationship without at the same time granting a license going forward. The gabe get amra Torah usneya mashma afilu machas sina natura beliba leva. Aval below kra mashma afilu haki atzarach latzila. Aval kashanu rorim margishim sheyeshlo al ishto ava gemura. But if we know the relationship is an affectionate one, ubolagarisho samachmas ava gemura, and he wants to divorce her for her own benefit. He's going out to war. More to the point, he's ill and he's worried about ibum. Kagon kedei latzila minezek v'tzar kibenido nidon b'maisa geranal. He's sick, right? He's worried he's not going to recover. He wants to save her from yibum. Shabola atzila shalot tizakek liyibum. Sheyare shema yitzaeros b'chalitza. She'll be upset about the chalitza or whatever. She'll have to go track down the brother who knows where he is. Ukai gavna. Shema haget eino kores b'neim. Ube'emes b'mei churfi amanatiz manrab b'temazu. He says, when I was younger, I was like thinking, like, what would happen here? Ubechol pam sheshamati k'shay adam chola masukan v'lohaya labanim. Listen to the window into these people's mind. He said, every time I heard of a case of somebody who didn't have children, who was ill, and he had brothers, the shamati mikrove ha'isha she'amru li ishtadlu mimenu get kedei lahatz elisha b'zika sayabim ha'yisi mishtomeim matmiya belibi. He says, I was upset. Is that a real get? That's not get out of hate. Nehechan lamdu rabosenu kadmonenu lo markein. How do you know that there is such a get out of love? Shari zayadua. He's divorcing his wife. Everybody knows that they have a good relationship. Shema haget ain't a chorus, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe the only time a get works is if there's rancor and the marriage is broken down. Even if we were psychoanalyzing and saying that ikdicha tavshilo or matza isha noimenu is that reflects that toxicity, but without the toxicity, there can be divorce when everybody is getting along swimmingly. They don't put terrorists, and how would it work if he divorces her under those conditions? Maybe it won't work, right? It's just a fascinating, recounting of his life, odyssey with this one topic. He said, every time I bump into my teachers or my colleagues, I discuss this with them. And I wasn't satisfied with their answer. Ad shekarasi the Masachet Yevamos. Then one day I was reading, doing some light reading in Masachet Yevamos, V'lamadati b'mishnah perek isha rabba matzasi b'ishto b'gemara shenishashra b'daiti. I came across a passage in the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and then the light went off, the light bulb in my mind went off, and I figured the whole thing out. Zelashona Mishnah. Ezu Dorash Rabbi Elazar ben Masya, Isha Grusha Meisha, Velo Meish, She'eno Isha. What does this mean, this pasuk, Isha Grusha Meisha? A woman who gets divorced from her husband. Who then is she going to get divorced from? The Amrina Begamara, Omer Rav Yudah Marav, Havale, right? L'Rabbi Elazar l'Midrash Marganisa, V'Darish Bechaspa. My Marg, what's the pearl here? The Jew, the gem. The Tanya Isha Grusha Meisha, Filon is Garsha Ela Meisha, Psula la Kahuna. Behind Ureya Chaget, Shaposam. It says, I came across this Gemara that said if there's a half a get, a one-dimensional get, meaning a termination of the relationship of husband and wife without the heter isha l'shuk, that works for kahuna, disqualifies for kahuna. The zelosh and Rashi, I'm skipping 3 lines. Harei l'cha b'feirush she'ish yachol legarish ishto shetei megureshes mimenu levado. Shehu lo yikarei od isha. Apparently there's a chalov, there's a category, a different parsha, the one that doesn't say v'yatza v'haisa, right, where he can be divorced from her simply by terminating their relationship. He's saying that isn't only reach haget. There should be one other issue that is affected by that, namely, there's no brothers. If there's no husband, there's no brother of a husband. She's not called his wife anymore. As long as he's alive, there's no license to get married to someone else because he only terminated their relationship. He never gave her the second part. How come you can't do that in a get shel sina? Because there it says v'yatza v'hais, exactly what.
How can you terminate and not free her? What does that mean to terminate? They're all connected. Termination means freedom. How do you separate the two? If you terminate a relationship, that means she's free to do what she wants.
No.
How can you terminate it and not let her go free?
Everything that we're trying to explain is that you see from the psul kahuna that there can be an in-between status, that when it comes to kahuna, if he tries to terminate their relationship without her being able to remarry, without having the license, that is a partial get with regard to being disqualified for kahuna. And the Levush is arguing it has one other impact. Because it focuses on the relationship between husband and wife, even though it doesn't permit her to remarry, it eliminates the status of Yibum. The whole point is that the Levush is suggesting that what we see in kahuna is not limited to kahuna. It is a category called get me'ava, which retains the exclusivity of their relationship, even as it frees her from Yibum by means of, the temporary, at least, termination of their relationship. Okay, so I'm not going to go further with it. There's 3 or 4 more pages here for anybody who wants to just read. It's this fascinating reading. The Levush came up with a new concept, a new category called Get Me'ava, which is a partial or one-dimensional divorce, which has the consequence not only of Reach HaGet, of disqualifying her from kahuna, when he says, Hariat migureshes mimeni, the i'at, or rights, the i'at muteret l'chol adam. But in addition, according to the Levush, it exempts her from Yibum and Chalitza. But because he's out of the picture, he can't write her he can't now write her a license to get married to everybody else. The only thing he can do is remarry her. Now, of course, if he remarries her, he can then divorce her, in a normal way. So that's still a possibility. It's not completely.
The view of the Levush accepted in the halakha community.
So, in my opinion, this Levush was not accepted. Except that, what I'm suggesting, except he was Levush, they talked about it a lot. By the way, they asked the Levush, they said, how come you didn't write this psak in your work on psak halacha, the Levush? So he said, in part of this tshuva, he says, oh, it's just so obvious. I didn't think I even had to put it in. It's like once you see it and once you realize it, it's like, it's not even worth wasting, space for this. So the person who did buy into that was a Baruch Prishel Perlo, who thinks that he found antecedents in the Gaonim already, a tshuva of Reb Saadia Gaon, another Gaon, another, who thinks that mainstream Rishonim agree with this idea. Meaning, if you look at Sefer Mitzvah Reb Saadia Gaon, he makes pages and pages and pages where he tries to show that this lavush is not an idiosyncratic, position, but that it really has a lot of support. If you ask me, I think that both historically and substantively, it has a little more support, than you might think. But in the end of the day, I think it is a, clearly a very, very idiosyncratic and minority view. But I do think that the principle behind it, namely that there are two elements, two dimensions in Gittin, and the Reach HaGet part of it, the disqualification of that, I think is true. And I think the Lavush really did an enormous service by highlighting, the potential of splitting these two components. By the way, we have a split of components on the Isha's side. That's what we were saying before. When a person gets married, right? So Erusin prior, again, in our weddings, we do Erusin and Nisuin together, right? We have you go to the hall, and under the chuppah, you have, the Kiddushin, and you're standing under the chuppah. And then you go to the Yichud room. So, it's all done at the same time. In the olden days, there was typically like a year between the Erusin, the Kiddushin, in other words, and the Nisuin. So for that year, right, they were not allowed, the husband and wife were not allowed to live together, right? But she was already, prohibited to have any kind of, relationship with anybody else.
So why is that not used by anybody as a proof that we could separate?
I think it's
corruption. Why? I mean, shouldn't that be? In other words, wouldn't that be anybody? Why not establish the idea that in the original Kedushin Nisuin there is a separation? It was
in Kedushin, it's clear. I mean, again, the question is what's Naraisa, what's Rabbi. For example, the Ravid is of the opinion that that the prohibition of husband and wife during Erusin is Minat Torah. So there's a year where they're not allowed to live together Minat Torah, but she's an Eishes Ish vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Now, do you have that also in Gerushin? That's trickier because there aren't two phases to Gerushin. I mean, in Kiddushin, there are two phases, Kiddushin and Nisuin, so it's broken up that way. In Gerushin, typically, what Jacob was saying before, which is, we don't, typically accept that, ability, to split this in two. We think two things happen, but we usually think that two things happen at the same time.
But maybe
in Reach HaGet,
right,
you have, an aspect of Isha Grusha Me'isha. The question is that D'oraisa D'Rabbanan. That's why the Lavush is such a find, because he's saying, no, there's something called a get me'ava, where actually she is not, anymore married to her husband, even though she doesn't have license to marry anybody else either. And that is Minat Torah. That's the second parsha of Gittin, the parsha of Reach HaGet, according to Lavush, that's all Minat Torah. In my view, it's still a very minority view, and it's not something that we paskin like, but it's still a fascinating.
In the time of the Lavush, were they doing the Erusin and the Nisuin at the same time already, like we do today?
I'm not sure.
Because then you might think that if they already went to the trouble of saying,
I mean, it was like their consciousness, but that would be like a historical consciousness.
They went to that because of the fear that might happen between the year split, and in so doing, they didn't want to introduce that separation into the.
I don't think.
Just historically, I'm not saying that.
No, I understand.
Why would they want to?
The difference between Erusin and Nisuin, legally and conceptually, is not dependent upon whether there's a time lag, or not. So
why would they want to avoid in a get chalitza, yevamos and chalitza, and leave her an aguna?
Well, he's not leaving her an aguna if he's. The point is, if they have a good relationship, right? So they don't want a divorce, or he doesn't want her, to just move on yet. So the point is, according to the Lavush, he can relieve her of that problem, and they can, then resume their marriage, right?
Right.
It would only be if something, again, he did this out of affection. So, if things, all of a sudden went south, in their relationship, and then all of a sudden he became like, a vindictive person, then that could be a problem. But typically it's not a problem because the whole background is that he only does this, he only engages in this practice for her sake. He's looking out for her.
Aren't we conflagrating emotions and intent with a legal document which has to stand on its own without any...
this legal, according to the Lavush's legal, Lavush sees this as a legal category. He thinks that just like that's why, again, you have to remember the precedent of Reach HaGet. Reach HaGet proves, if it's biblical, which most people, excluding the Rambam, think that it is, prove that the phenomenon of separating the personal relationship from the license of remarriage, that phenomenon is biblically true. Once that is true, the Lavush, again, let me make it clear, I don't think anybody paskins like the Lavush, but the Lavush was a very significant authority, and this was a very famous controversy.
It's a brilliant concept.
So it's just worth understanding and knowing because it highlights, these perspectives. But according to the Lavush, it's not, again, this is not, intentions. It's all this is documented in the language of the get. The get would be written mostly to say, although the Lavush doesn't think it has to, but others would think it has to. Harei at migureshes mimeni, v'iat muteris l'chol adam. The goal of it would be to, neutralize, the obligation of yibum the chalitza. The effect of it would be that they, would be able to remarry or have to remarry, if he survives. If he doesn't survive, then there's a huge benefit in that she doesn't have the zika of yibum and chalitza. But it's not reading anybody's mind. It's not even only verbal, according to most. It's captured in the text, in the contract of the get. It's written in this way, just as for Reach HaGet, it would be written this way. So it's not left to imagination. This is a legal document. What we're just saying is there are two, according to Lavush, there are two types of gittin. They have different texts, a get me'ava, a get misina.
I think this is a brilliant exposition of the psukim in the Torah.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It is quite a... And just to be clear about it, I'm sorry we're running way over time. I apologize, but we get excited sometimes over the material. But the Lavush, the creativity, and remember, he's applying this in a real case. He's a dayan in this case, and the certitude and the creative reading of the psukim, v'yatzav v'haisa in the parsha and Kitetze, and isha grusha me'isha in the parsha of Psulei Kahuna. I mean, there's just so much here that is a fascinating window into the thinking of great halachic thinkers. But in the end of the day, you also have to win over the consensus of halachic opinion. In my estimation, he totally, this did not win the day.
Very often is very often is too fearful to undertake this kind of...
I don't think it's fearful. I think this is very mechudash. I don't think it's a fear issue. I think it's...
I'm afraid of doing the wrong thing and being responsible for later on for children who are mamzerim and things of this kind.
I mean, the Lavush was very well intentioned. What he was really railing against was, you're going to allow this, in his opinion, this was not a proper get, not a get that would allow her to remarry. And therefore, what literally was at stake was a capital offense and the potential of children who would be tainted, with the stigma of mamzerus. So from his point of view, as he had conviction that this is the right way to read the psukim, this is the right way to read the Gemaras. He felt it so strongly that from his point of view, he had to, step in the breach, and the language you could see is so sharp and so, so laden with conviction. But I think that the consensus view, not because of fear, but just out of this is a little bit of too big a chiddush, if you know what I'm saying. So I think it still reflects certain ideas that are true, but as a full-blown, there's not enough. I think the other, authorities felt there wasn't enough evidence, or this was too much of a discovery, for this first to be discovered and articulated in the 16th century, after all of, the years of halachic history, they felt that was just unlikely. So they didn't go with it. And then when Rabbi Yerucham Fischel Perlow came around, he was enamored with it. And then he started looking again, and he found some more evidence. But I don't think that the evidence that he found establishes this as a consensus view. I really don't. I mean, I would be happy if it was, because I think it's a fascinating, an insightful perspective. I think there's much you can use from this, but I don't think it is the normative, except it's definitely not the normative accepted ruling. But it brings to sharper clarity a lot of the issues that we've been discussing anyway. So I hope next week we'll start from the beginning. I'll send in some Makomos. We're going to start from the first parak. We're going to talk about Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Meir, the requirements of Lishma. So we'll discuss the first chapter next week. These were introductory chapters that hopefully gives us insight into some of the principles of divorce and some of the categories.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Have a good
Thank you very much. Yes.
Have a good weekend and a good holiday for everybody.
Do you have time for one question?
What's that? Sure.
Do you have time for one question?
Yeah, sure.
If we say that a man gives a partial get,
Yeah.
and she's stuck and she can't get remarried, do we also say that he can't get remarried? Because we say that you're only allowed to have one wife.
Well, if in the post Rabbeinu Gershom period, that's correct. In the in the biblical time, he could marry more than one, just like the Avos could. But post Rabbeinu Gershom, where polygamy was prohibited, then if she's stuck, he's stuck. Presumably.
Thank you.
I would assume so, anyway. But actually, I should check it out. I'm not 100% sure. But I would, let me think about that. Either way, she's not stuck if they do remarry and then they get divorced.
Right, but she can't marry anybody else in the interim.
In the interim, she can't marry anybody else. But remember that he did this. That's what everybody has to. That's what you have to keep in mind. He created this, this partial get because of the good relationship that they had,
as opposed to just being evil and wanting
no.
to mess
And
her up.
if it had done, he can't do it if the motivation is sinna, because according to the Levush, because that's the other parsha. That's the parsha in Kitetse. There it has to be v'yatzav haisa le'ish acher. There cannot be any divorce, which doesn't include any divorce out of hostility. Has to, according to the Levush, has to include the component of a license to remarry. Only a divorce that comes to ameliorate, and to benefit her, can have this in between status. That's the view of the Levush.
Thank you.
Which I don't think we accept the halacha anyway. But what that means is, that the danger of it. There's always a danger of misusing something, but it's a remote danger when you consider that it can only apply in a case where the motivation is constructive. Good. Anyways, have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.